Sustainable You is a casual, interactive, yet informative series detailing and cataloging the sustainability experience. Moreover, this is a short podcast docuseries detailing the thoughts and experiences of passionate advocates towards all things eco-friendly. Our journey is to know how and why understanding sustainable development towards the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet can contribute to a more mindful, holistic, and inclusive world. Specifically, this podcast showcases what makes you a changemaker, innovator, and transformer as you tackle sustainability challenges for current and future generations to resolve the so-called wicked problems. So we have a rather unique episode today in which we become open to exploring possibilities of environmentalism and animation, especially in regards to Studio Ghibli. We sat down for a convo with one UK-based researcher, in particular who specializes in digital infrastructures and sustainability. Dr. Yuan Pan's interdisciplinary research focuses on developing digital solutions to connect humans with nature and conserve social-ecological systems. Her expertise spans biodiversity conservation, environmental video game design, ecosystem services valuation, and natural capital assessment. For today's episode, I learned more about how the medium of digital animation has fundamentally revitalized the understanding of environmental stewardship towards the greater good of sustainable development. Since the late 1980s, audiences worldwide have been captivated by the animation masterpiece that is Studio Ghibli. Each and every film showcasing absolutely phenomenal landscapes, picturesque lifelike scenery, and thought-provoking entertainment, offering a unique lens to explore our relationship with the natural realm. Again, it does so by exposing the malevolence of global warming and climate change. Studio Ghibli's spellbinding approach to animation conveys an unwavering message to audiences of forging an intrinsic connection to nature. It thereby illuminates environmental consciousness and has captivated our generation for decades. Let's hear more on what Yuan's thoughts are on this extraordinary phenomenon and its genuine and authentic influence on modern audiences.
I am Yuan Pan. I'm currently a lecturer in digital infrastructures and sustainability at the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London. So I started off as a traditional environmental scientist, and now I have moved into the field of environmental social sciences and humanities. I am interested in exploring human-nature relationships, as well as depictions of human-nature relationships in animated films, and creating environmental themed video games.
Okay, so actually before I jump into the questions and I get you to introduce yourself, we're just going to play a quick icebreaker game just to get to know you better. If you're cool with that.
Cool.
So basically I'm going to give you a list of words and you're going to just choose one adjective from the list to best, I guess, describe your personal nature. So you just choose one word, I'll send it through your email, and then you can choose one word. And again, it's not meant to typecast your personality or nature as type A or B or anything like that. It's just to basically describe and depict your persona in relation to your vocation as like a researcher and your career. So,
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll send that to you now.
Okay, so did you say you want me to choose a few words, or like 3 words out of this list?
Just one word, so one that best, again, extra persona. Yeah, just one.
Okay. Just one word, and let me just have a look at this. Okay, I guess maybe this is sounding too confident. Out of this list, I would say the word brave.
Okay, and why did you pick that word?
I guess I was gonna pick probably either brave or quirky. One, because I'm probably not a very traditional researcher. I have been labeled by my friends since I was young, and probably other researchers, as being quite loud. And I think as I have gone down the field of environmental sciences, sometimes it can be difficult to be a person of color, I think in this field especially. So sometimes as I progressed in this area of research, I think you have to be brave and kind of voice your voices, because sometimes that probably puts you at risk for some maybe researchers at disliking you, or, you know, some potential other senior people, they might think you're too loud for voicing your opinions. So I would say sometimes you have to be brave, I think, in this field generally.
Okay, cool. No, it's interesting to hear your perspective on that, especially being a researcher. And just on that, so what makes you uncertain and what makes you curious?
So what makes me... Sorry, what did you say the first word was?
Uncertain, and then what makes you curious?
Okay, I think what makes me curious, definitely in this field, is because I started off in a very traditional field in biology and then ecology itself. When I was younger, I chose this field because personally I don't like humans. I'm a pessimist. Maybe I've changed across the years. I didn't even want to interact with humans when I was younger. So I loved plants and animals better than I would say humans. But as I've progressed in my career, I have become progressively curious, I guess, about human society, because I realized there was no point doing environmental protection if we didn't link humans into the equation. So what I'm continually curious about in this field is what defines us as humans. Why do certain people make certain choices? Is it social factors? Is it genetic factors? Is it possible to change people's behaviors? Is it possible to change people's opinions when it comes to environmentalism or nature conservation? And I guess that is also something I am personally uncertain about. Sometimes I can be a bit of a pessimist when it comes to human society. So I guess both things, yeah, I can be uncertain and curious about the state of humanity.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a very profound response. It's interesting to hear your perspective and how, you know, you kind of started out and how you are now as a researcher. And just to get to know you a bit more, so tell me a bit more about yourself. Because you had mentioned a bit how you're more, I guess, more of an introvert, and now growing up and you didn't really want to interact with others. And I mean, it's interesting now where you are in your career as a researcher. So I want to know about your struggles, your aspirations, and contributions that led you towards participating in academic research, especially because your field would be, as I read, biodiversity conservation and digital social humanities, and how you really got involved being a researcher in environmentalism. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, so I would, generally, my friends think I'm an extrovert, but I probably swing between being extroverted and introverted. So there are times when I'm like, I hate everyone, I need probably some of my own time. So I did start off, like I said, very different from, you know, I'm in a department of what's defined as digital humanities now, which actually was quite a career change for me recently. I started off in traditional biology, you know, because I was interested in animals and plants. For a while, I thought I wanted to do something more traditional, like zoology, you know, plant biology, or maybe even entomology, because I really loved insects as a child. But gradually, as I moved through my career, so what really pivoted me was during my final years as an undergraduate, I started working with London Zoo around conservation of endangered species. And I realized during my field work that actually, for many of the endangered species, we can't actually sample them or see them at all during field work because they're endangered. So what do we do when there's a lack of data about endangered species? Then quickly, my supervisor at London Zoo at the time, he said, well, one of the things that you can look at is what's called local ecological knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. As researchers, we can't be in the field around these environments for, a long time because we don't have a lot of money or resources. But actually, the local communities, they have been there a long time, and they have probably, seen these endangered species. I ended up doing a lot of community questionnaires around endangered species conservation, and we uncovered a lot of knowledge that probably wouldn't have been attained through traditional environmental or ecological methods, just from looking at the species alone. And so that's why I started to pivot my research around more environmental, social-based things. And as I progressed into my PhD, I came into contact with a concept called ecosystem services, which is the benefits that human society obtain from nature. So this is a concept where we actually view humans as part of nature rather than viewing humans, separate from nature, which is what I had done before. And I guess my kind of interest in that just gradually increased from my PhD as I gradually became known as the social scientist in the environmental sciences areas.
Okay, great. Yeah. No, it's interesting how you kind of made that transition into where you are now. And I agree with your point that you made earlier. I'm more of an ambivert, and I don't like that whole typecast of, introvert, extroverted. So it's interesting how you kind of started off and you became more into this field and now you're into more sustainability and environmentalism. And just on that, what would you say are the most important personal satisfactions and dissatisfactions connected with your research field in particular? What do you particularly find most satisfying, and what do you find the most challenging?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think what we all find challenging, I think, working in environmental sciences is probably being optimistic about the future. So we do actually have a movement started by the University of Oxford called Conservation Optimism, where they share stories of hope rather than everything negative. I think the issue is, for me personally, I am a bit of a pessimist. Even though sometimes, I do think future generations will be better than us, sometimes when the news is quite pessimistic, especially around my area of research, which is biodiversity conservation, I think it's hard to keep up hope. Many of the things that I now do evolve around, potentially changing human behaviors, and that ties in with human society. So as you know, with recent news, so I was mentioning that it's difficult to keep up optimism in this line of work, with especially the current state of the world, as we know. But I think what is inspiring in this field is, one, I do believe that, future generations, there are many of the younger people who are becoming more interested in environmentalism as a whole. And personally, my research actually into, human-nature relationships in Studio Ghibli films has been something that kept me going. That side of research, I think, has reached a wider range of audiences than any of my traditional academic research. I've had quite personal feedback from people, who said these films have actually changed their lives or inspired them to do different things to do with environmentalism. So I think that's something, that is inspiring to me and is important when we're losing hope.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's definitely interesting to hear how that has affected you and how has really shaped your career choice. And now we're just going to go a bit more, we'll eventually get to the more Studio Ghibli questions, but I just want to get to know a bit more about you as a person and you as a researcher. So this next question is, how do you personally view sustainability and sustainable development, especially within the climate action sector and biodiversity conservation in general?
So actually we were just talking about this in our department with other colleagues who kind of work in environmental humanities and social sciences. So personally, I view, one, we use the word sustainable, we have to be quite careful. So many companies will use the word sustainable quite frequently in their reporting, but sometimes, it is a form of greenwashing. sustainability can mean very different things for different types of people, depending on, who are you talking about? Is it, communities? Is it a company? Is it policymakers? I think any time that anyone mentions sustainability, you have to define quite carefully, what do you mean? What is your understanding of sustainability? And also what exactly are you trying to do? What exactly are you trying to protect? Where are you trying to protect it? And over kind of what time frame? So you have to be quite specific about those things. The other things about, I think, climate change issues, which I think most people probably have heard about, and it is generally in the public sphere. In terms of my research, I'm probably more worried about, it's not only in the public, but even when I asked environmental science students, few of them actually know about the biodiversity loss crisis globally and how important it is actually to human well-being. Many of the environmental science students I teach, especially in first year, they will have known something about climate change. Or, for example, the International Panel on Climate Change. They'll know something about it, even if they're not well versed in it. But when we ask them, have you heard anything about biodiversity conservation? Generally, we draw a blank. So that is something that is quite worrying to me personally, because I think biodiversity is probably very important, if not as important as climate change is towards human well-being.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a very valid point. And what would you say are your personal core values and intent in regards to, I guess, living a more sustainable lifestyle?
I think my core values for living a more sustainable lifestyle is one, be careful of overconsumption, which sometimes I may fall trapped to as well. Because I think with technology, with algorithms on your mobile, we do fall into the traps of buying things that we probably don't need, that probably we need to look into things, around our local area where we can recycle and reuse things. Recently, I have looked up and been to a very good repair cafe near me. And, a very nice lady, an older lady, she helped me to repair one of my coats for free, which otherwise, I might not reuse that coat. And I guess the core values, I would say, around sustainability and living a better life, generally environmentally friendly, is probably also just having more compassion and kindness. I think this applies to, academic research. This applies to the workplace. This applies to your normal day-to-day life. I think we don't focus enough, and we don't teach younger kids or even students enough about, let's focus on the academic or the research achievements, because I think there are many people who are very competent in academia, but also teaching them from a young age about compassion, about kindness, about trying to understand different people's values and opinions without trying to make, someone who's different from you just saying that, they are just bad people and we are not communicating with them.
Hey, no, that's really insightful to hear your opinion on that. I did my thesis on sustainable fashion, and it was really eye-opening to me because I didn't realize, I don't know how it is in the UK, but in Scandinavia, it was like, it's very much integrated into their lifestyle to live more sustainably, with the biking and the consignment. Like, we have that stuff here too, like secondhand shopping, but it's not really integrated into people's lifestyles, and I feel North Americans, we tend to get typecasted as being pretty wasteful, but it's definitely interesting to hear your perspective on that. And then for the next question, what do you find to be, I guess, the one key offering of your current research? Because I know you kind of switched focus a little bit, so do you want to talk more about that?
I think the one key focus, or what I've found from my research, is I think from the beginning of my career, of course, I came from a biology environmental background, that, sustainability or environmentalism, it isn't one discipline. Traditionally, it's come from the natural sciences. We've absorbed many different disciplines as we have, progressed from psychology, from social sciences, from economics, from anthropology, and now environmental humanities. I think my research has shown me that we have come to a point where, every discipline or every student should probably learn something about environmental sustainability in their course, that it applies to everyone. And to solve these challenges, we need people from different disciplines to really talk to each other and to really break down these silos, which is actually quite hard in an academic environment sometimes.
No, that's a valid point. And from your perspective, what are the major problems you see in your field? Like, do you have any particular maybe social problems, social and environmental problems that maybe overlap that you've identified that you're responding through your work?
Yeah. So probably one of the key things we've been trying to address for the past few years is, why biodiversity conservation is not as prominent or as on people's agendas as climate change. There are many obvious issues around this. Now, climate change has become something that you can quite envision quite clearly. There's a 2 degrees or a 1.5 degrees change. It's something that's quite tangible now. Most people can kind of grasp their head around it. In terms of biodiversity conservation, it's just something that's quite multifaceted and complex. In terms of researchers who are experts in biodiversity conservation, we really can't come to a conclusion or agreement on how do you measure, what is a good biodiversity level that's being conserved around the world. There are many different indicators you can take, and we don't quite agree. But as a result, which is good, I think, from a research perspective from the view, but if we don't agree as researchers, then the policymakers or the company people who might have an interest in measuring their effects on biodiversity will just say, well, you don't agree, this is too complex, we will just leave it out of our reporting. And I think that is one of the major issues. There is still a slight disconnect within the research background compared to, the real world.
Okay, great. Just going on to this next question, is there a favorite aspect that you have of being an academic researcher focused on, I guess, this interesting cross between environmentalism, sustainability, and digital animation? What kind of speaks to you? What makes you passionate about it?
I guess what makes me passionate is, one, I just really love animation, and I think what I have realized about my research, so I do a lot of data analysis still, and I think, all kind of policies or, when we report to companies or policymakers, data is still very, very important. We need to have evidence-based research. But we know from environmental psychology that people don't change, right? People don't change their opinions based on lots of graphs, on lots of data. What's interesting to me is that animation as a form, as a narrative, as films, they change us. They're transformative experiences. They move us. When you're moved and it stirs an emotion within you, you want to change something. We know from neurosciences that when you feel emotional, you're having a different response in your brain. Different parts of your brain light up compared to when you see lots and lots of data. You are not going to be feeling compelled or moved to change something or change your behavior.
Right. No, that's totally valid. And on this next question, what, I guess, motivates you to keep going in this field and pursuing this endeavor? Because you talk to people that were climate scientists or work in climate action in general, and it seems like you have to be very persistent and passionate, otherwise you face a lot of burnout. Do you want to talk more about your motivation behind that?
Yeah. I wouldn't say we don't burn out. I think we do have frequent burnouts being in this field. But I do think a source of motivation for me is, one, talking to kind of real people or actual local communities who might be impacted and listening to, kind of their aspirations for the future or their fears about, environmental impacts. But also, I think probably my students. I think a large part of the reason that I stayed in the university environment still, because I could go off and just be a pure researcher in another research institute, is actually the teaching. And I think hearing from my students about their hopes, their kind of environmental activism is probably a source of inspiration for me that, the future could be better.
Okay, no, that's really insightful. And just kind of going a bit more into, I guess, how you were inspired growing up. So how did you personally foster a love of not just Studio Ghibli, but animation in general? How did it, I imagine, transform from being more of a leisurely hobby growing up, like a lot of us, just watching these films as a kid, to influencing, I guess, your career choice as a scientist and a researcher?
Yeah. So as a child, so I didn't watch actually Studio Ghibli probably until I was maybe 11 or 12 or something. Actually, when I was younger, I watched, because I spent parts of my childhood in China. So China imported an anime that was done by a Japanese studio. It's actually the Moomins. The original Moomins animation was actually made by a Japanese animation studio in probably the 1990s, and it was aired in China. And, the Moomins kind of frolicking in their forest. And, the same kind of tranquility that you get in a Studio Ghibli film, I watched that, religiously as a child, until I actually came over here to the UK. I didn't quite get the Moomins were the same thing as the same animation I'd watched in China. And I think that inspired me as a child. I also spent quite a lot of time in the countryside, with my grandparents' side. And I think back then we did a lot of activities as children, just spending unstructured playtime in nature, like, trying to catch dragonflies and pond dipping in the river, which I think probably as I grew up, because of urbanization, because of safety issues, many children probably just lack nowadays. I think that kind of inspired me to go on the environmental sciences route. Now, in terms of the Studio Ghibli route, that actually happened because of the pandemic. I've always been a massive fan of Studio Ghibli. And during the pandemic, I was stuck as a researcher, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to do a personal passion project that has nothing to do with my real research. I'm going to spend some time looking at Studio Ghibli films, because I realized that even though many of the Studio Ghibli films were made in the 80s and 90s, actually what they had depicted back then are now buzzwords in our field. He's depicted something very complex, but in a popular culture type of film. And I was like, this is something people should know about. This is something that my other environmental colleagues should be showing their children instead of only Disney Pixar films.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. I had no idea Moomin was from Japan. I thought it was a Swedish thing. Well, that's interesting. I had no clue, but...
It's actually an experience, just
right.
Yeah. But they sold it, basically. So they sold the rights to a Japanese animation studio, and they made the animation for the first movements, basically.
Okay, but it's definitely interesting to see your trajectory, too. Just kind of, you said you were pretty outdoorsy growing up, and I agree. I don't see a lot of children these days necessarily having that. So it's interesting to see how that kind of determined your career path to go into environmental sciences, and how, you kind of use the downtime during the quarantine to kind of go and, like you said, like make it kind of like your side hustle or your passion project. So it's definitely very interesting. And do you have we're going to get into this a bit later in the interview, but do you have a particular Studio Ghibli movie that maybe even not growing up, but what would be your all-time favorite Studio Ghibli movie?
That's an easy question because I get asked this a lot. It's probably Princess Mononoke, because that film particularly depicts human-wildlife conflict very well, but also in a very non-Eurocentric way, which is not, very untraditional compared to kind of traditional Disney Pixar films.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, no, it's definitely interesting to hear your perspective. My personal favorite, it has nothing, it's not one of the, World Wildlife Fund, depicted ones. Mine is Kiki's Delivery Service, which is like, it doesn't really have to do with like environmentalism, but for me, I chose particularly, like, it's one of the reasons why I chose to go to Gotland for grad school in Sweden, because it's based off of that, and I think it's, you know, and I had to study sustainable business models and whatnot, and I'm like, oh, well, she's like a witch with her cat, and, you know, she's like a witch in training with her cat, you know, learning how to like run her own delivery business. So, and I had to like ironically write about that, like, you know, business models. So yeah, it's definitely interesting to hear your, you know, what your favorite is. Okay, that's great. And then, sorry, just going on to the next question. So how has the medium of digital animation helped resolve and overcome any tough moments in your life? Like, I know you said you kind of got into it, like Studio Ghibli in particular later on, but has it helped you overcome like moments of doubt or any difficult moments?
I think definitely. I do think whenever I feel terrible about the world, I do just watch Totoro. I'll put it back in the background. Because I think it's just a very reassuring, calming film where nothing much dangerous, you know, or serious happens, but it just has a very calming effect on everyone. So, yes.
Okay. Oh, no, that's a good point. It is kind of like therapy, like, in a way, like, I agree. Like, even listening to lo-fi on YouTube, like Studio Ghibli lo-fi is really nice while studying, so it's, yeah, no, it does definitely help. Okay, and then I wanted to ask this a bit earlier, but I can ask this now. So what would be your personal definition of sustainable development and sustainability? And yeah, you can talk more about that.
So personally, I'm not saying one size fits all. I think for sustainability or sustainable development to happen, we are trying to fulfill the demands of the current generation. So that means, you know, on some levels, we are probably harvesting nature's resources. There will be places where, you know, nature is not completely preserved, but we have to be filling in the demands of our current generation without seriously harming, you know, the demands of the future generation. And I think this is where we need to draw a line. We need to have discussion with different communities, including whose values count in sustainable development or sustainability. I think that picture looks very different compared to who is making those decisions.
Okay, interesting. And just on that question, do you advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals? Is there a particular SDG that you best advocate for? And the second part of this question would be, do you still think metrics like these hold merit?
So generally, I would say the UK universities like us to tie our research to the UN SDGs. So usually for the environmental sciences, that'll be like life on land or life in water, etc. But generally, we will also tie our research into other things, for example, like education, etc. So I think the UN SDGs definitely still have value because, you know, one, they have those nice little icons you can put in your presentation. When you're talking to companies, when you're talking to policymakers, they like those little blocky icons. They also look good when you're talking to someone who's not from environmental sciences. I think they do still hold value. Do we need better indicators or better, you know, ways to measure them? Probably yes. We probably need more complex ones or, you know, multi-dimensional kind of indicators to better understand the issues. But I think they do still have a value currently.
Okay, interesting. It's definitely, it's good to hear your viewpoint on this because I remember when I was in grad school at least, and it might just be like maybe a cultural perspective in Sweden, but I also grew up, you know, just even going to university, seeing, you know, the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that was just like the norm. But I remember them almost bashing on the SDGs because they said they very much tell like a, like, how do you say it? Like a more like a human-centric, like a self-centered perspective. It's more towards the Anthropocene. And then it's not really taking into account all, flora and fauna inclusively. It's not, again, giving that ecocentric or biocentric perspective. So I thought that was interesting. And then, that you can get more into that, but even the term, and that's why I like asking people's definition of it, because even the term, sustainable development is a paradox in and of itself. And people are like, oh, well,
It's also true.
Right, yeah, and it doesn't really, things like degrowth, or the degrowth movement I'm sure you heard about, doesn't exactly really fit the bill. So it's, it's definitely interesting to hear your perspective on that. Okay, great. So now we're kind of going to transition a bit away from just talking about your career as a researcher, and we're going to get more into the animation side of things and talking a bit more about Studio Ghibli, if that's cool. So let me just pull up those questions. Okay. So I'm just going to give a bit of an intro, and then I'll jump into the questions, and then we can, just keep going from there. So, as you know, Studio Ghibli was one of the first animated film production companies worldwide to jump on the bandwagon of the environmental movement, which first gained momentum in the 1970s. And you had mentioned, of course, Disney and Pixar were there too, but even more so than them, as they were really, honing in on this movement. So my first question is, why do you find Studio Ghibli's films have had such an immense impact on our childhood? And what makes them inherently unique and timeless and a powerful medium to portray concepts of climate change, including global warming?
Okay, that is a very good question and a deep question. So I think what makes Studio Ghibli timeless is I don't think Studio Ghibli necessarily jumped on a bandwagon environmentalism. I think Miyazaki, who is one of the co-founders, along with Takahata, of the studio, they are just people who are what I would call as very keen observers. There are many documentaries online about Miyazaki's creative processes. I think he thinks very deeply about things. Now, you'll notice from a business model, their studio is very not business positive. It's not a very successful business model. They take years. Takahata takes even slower than Miyazaki to produce any kind of film. Throughout his whole lifetime, Takahata probably produced, 4 or 5 films, and he lived to 80-something. I think what's important here is, starting in the 80s, both of them, bear in mind, are, quite older generation Japanese men. There are 3 central themes in all their films: environmentalism, pacifism, and feminism. They not only depict environmentalism, you'll notice that most of their characters are actually females. And Miyazaki is a bit of an opposer of what I call mainstream anime. He doesn't dislike all of mainstream anime, but he sometimes doesn't like his film being called anime because there's a certain stereotype around it. His film doesn't tend to sexualize or, simplify women. They also don't simplify issues. He believes that viewers of his films, some of them target at younger children, they need to be shown the complexity of the world. So Disney films or Pixar films, traditionally, have shown children a world where there is a bad person. Once the bad person is defeated, everything is good again. Whereas in most of Miyazaki's films, he doesn't have villains. He has antagonists. Those quotation marks antagonists, they can do bad things, but they can also do good things. He's always said that good people can do bad things, and who you think are bad people can do good things. And the world is complex and not black and white.
Okay, yeah, no, I didn't know that. That's actually very insightful that you mentioned that. And so do you find that there's a basic philosophy of an animation company like Studio Ghibli, especially when it comes to best advocating for environmental stewardship? Yeah, so do you think that they have, because you're talking a bit about how they don't release films very frequently, but when they do, it always has some sort of powerful message that goes along with it. So do you find like they have some sort of basic philosophy that they operate by when it comes to specifically like environmental stewardship?
Yeah, I think they do. I think they formed the studio together because, Takahata originally was kind of Miyazaki's teacher in animation, and, he looked up to Takahata his entire life. They formed the studio together because I think they have personal values that just align. I think in terms of that time, they both were interested in what's called environmentalism at the time. They weren't particularly happy with the way Japan developed, I think, and the rapid urbanization that happened in Japan. They were worried by the disconnect of, Japanese children as there was rapid urbanization. And I think those are some of the base philosophies that they operate by, and including they share, their love of pacifism, and, both are pretty anti-war. Miyazaki's quite outspoken and has been attacked on this issue in Japan many times. And both of them, I think, interestingly, I don't know their personal life, but I think Miyazaki, I do know a little bit that he had a very strong mother, and he attributes that to why he really has very strong female young characters in his films.
Okay, that's interesting. I had no clue. That's definitely interesting to hear that. And how do you find that Studio Ghibli effectively utilizes the medium of artistic animation to draw audiences in and to influence them to the extent that they do towards climate change activism?
So I think just by having very kind of, strong characters, many of them are either children or teenagers, do just really connect to younger audiences. Also, they don't kind of, dumb down the complex question. You'll notice in many of these environmental theme films, if there is a conflict or there's an issue to be solved, many times or frequently, especially in Princess Mononoke, there isn't a complete resolution. It isn't, suddenly everything is great again and we can, hurrah and celebrate. They leave space for the audience to think, what would they do in that situation?
Okay, that's actually a good point, yeah. And not even a cliffhanger, but they definitely invite the audience to really be deeply introspective. And I really respect that about the films. And just to go a bit on to this, because you talked a bit about the director and the genius behind Studio Ghibli. So how do you find Hayao Miyazaki's artwork evokes a sense of ecological consciousness in its viewers?
So I think in terms of artwork, in this present day, his animations are still very unique. He does insist, you can call him a traditionalist or a conservative, whatever, in terms of animation. He insists that his studio mostly still uses 2D animation, which means they still have to draw them very tediously and using, traditional. I was saying, I think, so Miyazaki still insists on very traditional methods to his animation. There are articles about this online. Some people view him as a traditionalist or a conservative. He insists on 2D animation. He's not been a fan of 3D animation, but I think as a result, his films do retain a very unique style in that, they look like paintings. He often carries like a traditional paintbrush around with him. And you can see that in his films, but probably more, I think, in some of Takahata's films, you can still see kind of the traditional kind of East Asian kind of paintings in their films. In the fact that they don't fill in the entire film, especially in Takahata's film, with color everywhere. They leave some white space, which means in the animation, it leaves some space for the viewers to kind of think and for them to fill in kind of the back gaps. So one of the ways not the artwork itself, is they also use a traditional method where if you watch Takahata or Miyazaki's films, they have these moments of silences, and they have a specific name in Japanese. They're called mas. They use these silences so that viewers will use that space to contemplate and think about what's been happening, rather than, action after action scene, which is more traditional in kind of Western animation films.
Okay, interesting. I never picked up on that. Are there, particular themes you've noticed, such as the one you just mentioned, Any particular themes you notice in these films that you would give a notable mention to?
Exactly, the environmentalism films. The most famous here being probably is Spirit Away, that most people probably do know. Is he does put in a lot of traditional, Japanese ideas into his films. The most notable here is animism. So traditional Japanese Shintoism, they believe in what's known as kami, or if we translate it into English, so spirit. So anything can have a spirit. Most notably, things like, rivers in Spirited Away can have a dragon spirit. Or even things like vegetables, or even things like a temple or a rock. They can all embody a spirit within them.
Okay, great. So now, just to get into taking a deeper dive into this, so we're gonna go through a handful of the films of Studio Ghibli films that have to do with environmentalism. So now I'm just gonna give a spiel of a handful, the top Studio Ghibli films, and you can speak to the story arc of each one in regards to environmentalism. And again, we just want to hear your perspective and based on your, niche area of research as well. And again, if you haven't watched any of these films, feel free to pass on it. And also, some of these are not classified under the World Wildlife Fund. I know you had mentioned that you watched those, just so you keep it in mind, but they nonetheless have that sustainable environmental theme to them subtly, in a way. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll get started, and then maybe, it's not necessarily in the years they're released, I'll just randomly be listing them off. Okay, so first let's start off with Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, released in 1984. Yeah. So just to give a bit of an intro about it, so I'm sure you watched the film, but basically this film situates itself on environmental destruction in a post-apocalyptic era, and is, of course, analogous to our postmodern society, in which we showcase, again, nuclear power plants, high-tech destructive weapons, and water and air pollution. This film is almost indicative of the Anthropocene, and, again, the dualistic divide of the man-made realm versus, again, the ecocentric, biocentric one, inclusive of all living beings. So that is, the viewer, when watching this film, learns that there is a delicate balance between man and nature. Of course, phenomena such as industrialization, as you know, have completely and utterly ravaged Mother Earth by effectively destroying the forest, animals, and the soulful essence of these living creatures. So in regards to the Anthropocene, especially when it comes to things like biocentrism, what are your thoughts or perspectives on this film?
So I think Nausicaa is probably, one of the most biocentric, if you want to call it, environmental films. It did receive a recommendation from the World Wildlife Fund years ago. So I think what's important here is, so in English translation, obviously Nausicaa is translated as a princess. I feel it's a princess of a small kingdom in this post-apocalyptic world. But I think what's important here is she isn't just a princess. She is a scientist. So the rest of the human society that's left on this post-apocalyptic world, they are terrified of the new ecosystem, which they call the toxic jungle or the sea of corruption, depending which translation you look at. They think that, it's toxic, it is evil, we need to avoid it at all costs. Nausicaa isn't only a princess, she is a scientist. She doesn't believe this is the truth. So she frequently travels into the toxic jungle with a face mask on because she wants to understand the truth about this ecosystem that has formed after the apocalypse, basically. And, before spoiling the film for someone who hasn't watched it, we find out the toxic jungle is actually not bad. It is actually something that nature produced to try to restore the post-apocalyptic Earth. But Nausicaa is the only one who can bridge the divide between humans and nature in this, quite scary world for humans. And the reason they highlight in the film, I think, which is quite prominent, is that she has compassion and kindness. Her compassion and kindness doesn't just extend to humanity, it extends to outside of humanity, to, also animals. One of the most prominent ones in the film is what's called omus. So omus are these giant kind of insects that appeared in this post-apocalyptic world. And it's quite interesting that Miyazaki chose this as kind of their central organism because, insects are not very charismatic species, I would say, in biodiversity conservation. But he has made these species very charismatic in the film. And the main character, Nausicaa, actually has a very strong connection to these giant insects that appeared in the world.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting to hear your perspective on this. And yeah, okay, great. And it definitely does relate to, again, that biocentric, ecocentric perspective. Okay, great. And now we're going to go on to the next one. So these are arguably one of the most famous and popular Studio Ghibli films. So both My Neighbor Totoro and Spirited Away. So one was released, of course, in the late 1980s, and one was released in 2001. And of course, both, as you already mentioned it, are about, well, especially Spirited Away is about animism and respecting spiritual deities in the natural world, such as forests, rivers, mountains, and showcases, again, how the protagonist in these films forges a strong emotional bond and connection to these deities through, their childhood memories. And again, it's indicative of how humankind, especially, you can even argue, indigenous societies since time immemorial, have relied on almost this supernaturalism, this force, or this spiritual energy. And I think you mentioned it's called Kama, or how... Yeah. So how it's dispelled from shamans, sorcerers, and wizards. Again, that idea of the supernatural. And again, we as humans, or Homo sapiens, should be paying our utmost respects to Mother Nature and the Earth. So do you want to talk a bit about these films?
Sure. So Totoro is one of the most loved films, I think, around East Asia. You'll see his face most places everywhere, like Mickey Mouse. I think the reason being, one of the film's key messages is, one, we have to have respect for nature, but also that we need to maintain kind of a childlike curiosity towards exploring nature throughout our lives. I think one of the reasons is, as adults, we lose touch with nature because we stop being a child. We don't have any unstructured playtime with nature, so we lose that connection. Now, in that film, it's also very important, and it's something that's now, picking up in research, that we know that nature is important for human well-being. That means mental health and physical health. In Totoro, the two young sisters, they move to the countryside because their mother is ill. As an adult watching the film, now you can think that Totoro, a furry forest spirit that appears to them in times of need, is Totoro real? Or is it a figment of their imagination? It doesn't really matter in this film, because we know that in this film, Totoro also is a symbolism of nurturing, because they don't have their mothers. Their mother is sick. They are probably very stressed as young children. But Totoro is this big, furry kind of creature that is the forest spirit, and Totoro always appears to them when, they need him. So he's acting as a surrogate mother figure. So in terms of Spirited Away, I think you've already said quite a lot about it. But perhaps one of my kind of most favorite characters in Spirited Away is No Face, which probably many people recognize. He's depicted as kind of a loning spirit that shows up at this spirit bathhouse. He's called No Face because he wears a mask. And during kind of the film, we see that No Face starts becoming very hungry and also very, quotation marks, capitalistic. He becomes corrupted by the bathhouse. He starts over-consuming, so it's kind of, I think a metaphor for what's happening in capitalism and our current society. No Face starts consuming a lot of food, like over-consumption. He starts gorging himself and he becomes bigger and bigger and becomes very monstrous, to the fact that he starts devouring all the other characters in the bathhouse and becomes an uncontrollable monster. And I think the reason for this, and that he still feels hungry, he still feels empty inside. I think No Face is quite a strong indicator of, certain individuals, and probably many individuals in society, that we try to fulfill the void in ourselves by overconsumption or buying a lot of things, but then we still feel empty inside. So we keep gorging ourselves until we become ugly monsters and we still don't feel satisfied. In the film, he's eventually, quotation marks, cured because the main protagonist's son feeds him magical medicine, and he manages to basically throw up everything he has consumed, and he becomes more calmer in temperament.
Okay. Yeah, no, I have to rewatch that one. I didn't pick up on some of those, but that's definitely really insightful to hear your perspective on that. And now we're going to move on to the next one, which is your all-time favorite. So, of course, the cult classic, like Princess Mononoke, is about a strong young warrior named Ashitaka, who is, of course, struck by a deadly curse, whose goal is to restore the decaying forest. And again, we see this conflict of, again, the villain or the antagonist, who is Lady Eboshi's domination of the forest, which ultimately ends up in destruction of the forest spirits. And of course, you have the heroine, Princess Mononoke, who is raised by wildebeests or wolves and despises, again, that selfishness, the gluttony, the hedonism we've kind of been talking about already, of humankind, she's essentially a euphemism, I would argue, about embodying an eco-feminine warrior.
Yeah.
And again, the argument of good versus evil, again, resonates throughout this film. And yeah, if you can talk more about it, especially when it comes to things like ecofeminism and the forces of reproduction, I think that would be a notable theme in this film. But do you want to talk more about that?
So yeah, I guess Princess Mononoke is probably my favorite film, but again, for any listeners out there, do not show this to young viewers just because it's called Princess Mononoke. It's a very violent and bloody film, and Miyazaki, made this film for slightly older audiences. I think you are very right in that Princess Mononoke, whose name is Sun, is raised by the wolf spirits. And she embodies someone, who's very strong. We first see her with a mask with blood coming down her face. She's very strong and, represents kind of feminism as well as embodying nature itself. She really hates humanity because she was raised by the wolf spirit, and, obviously the humans are destroying her homeland. But I think what's interesting about this film is Lady Eboshi, who is the antagonist/villain in this film, is probably my favorite character or my favorite antagonist of all time. Because unlike, I think, some other films, she is not a true villain. She is not destroying the forest out of gluttony or pure greed. We see that Lady Eboshi is a fierce female leader. She is trying to defend her own community of outcasts. She has built her own outcast community called Irontown. And the only way that Irontown can survive is by depleting the forest next to them and mining for iron from the soil. She's not doing it because, she wants to make herself really rich. We see that the community she has built is actually formed of former prostitutes and lepers. These are all outcasts of society. We see one of the main male characters called Ashitaka, who is cursed. When he visits Irontown, and one of the lepers is, depicted in a very bad state. And Ashitaka asks him, why is life so hard? And the leper says, life is terrible, but it's still worth living. So for Lady Eboshi, that's what really drives her. He doesn't see the destruction she is causing, but to preserve her own community, she needs to destroy the forest. And, meanwhile, she's a feminist herself. She's protecting these former prostitutes who have nowhere to go. It's probably looked down upon by the whole society. She's, nursing these lepers back to health, who were definitely outcasts back then. But what can she do in this situation other than, reap the kind of natural resources from the forest? And I think Miyazaki makes it very clear that he is not condemning Lady Eboshi's action. He is simply showing the destruction that she has caused. But as viewers, we are left to contemplate how to resolve such a conflict.
Okay, no, it's definitely interesting to hear the flip side of the argument. I never really thought about it like that, but she is kind of like a feminist herself, if you put it that way. And do you want to talk a bit more about I guess, like the ecofeminist theme in the film, if you think it's prominent. And again, ecofeminism, for those of you listening, again, is a powerful philosophy that highlights the intricate connections between, again, the oppression of women and the exploitation of nature. It challenges us to rethink our relationship with the environment and the role that gender plays in shaping our world. And I think this film, like, do you see certain, like, aspects of the film and the plot where you can argue that, you know, it's highlighting these dualisms, pointing to, like, a larger problem, I guess. But again, yeah, if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, so I think there are definitely themes of ecofeminism, even though I mean at the time Miyazaki probably didn't phrase it as this. So we can see obviously Princess Mononoke, some, you know, being the embodiment of this. But I think what is more interesting in this film is, you know, is Sam more connected to nature because she is female? I think they have very strong female characters who do embody feminism, but I think, you know, as her character, her being, you know, probably a strong woman is important to Miyazaki. But what's more important is, I think, her connection to nature because she was raised by the wolf spirits. And she also knows that, you know, nature, you know, like, as you mentioned, has a dualism. You know, nature isn't depicted as a self-furry entity here, as we have seen in Totoro. Nature just is, and I think that is part of my research as well. Nature isn't good or bad. We have a tendency sometimes in environmental sciences or, you know, in European American countries to think of nature as this purely happy place or this, you know, pure place. No, sometimes nature is brutal and violent, you know, and bloody, just like in this film. So the embodiment of this is in a forest spirit, which we see called the Shishigami. So Sun asks the forest spirit to cure Ashitaka's curse. Now, the forest spirit does, because Sun has a connection to the forest itself. But at times, we see the forest spirit also causing destruction or causing death. And you can see this specifically, I think, when you see the forest spirit as it appears to you as a deer at certain times of the day. Now, as the forest spirit walks in the deer form, it takes one step, a flower blooms, it takes another step, how the flower dies. That's the real, you know, embodiment of nature. Nature just is. Sometimes it causes death, sometimes it causes life. It isn't good or bad. It isn't, you know, always furry and great and pure. Sometimes it's violent, sometimes it's bloody, sometimes there are parts of nature we don't like as humans. And I think that's the important kind of theme of the film.
Okay, yeah, no, I agree. Like, it's not necessarily, like, the domination of women is intrinsically linked to the domination of nature. Like, it depends, like, as you mentioned. But I definitely like how this film, I think, like, I can see why it's one of your favorite Studio Ghibli films, because it makes you think on so many different levels, so many multifaceted different levels. Again, how we think about sustainability and, again, that interconnectedness between social and environmental issues. So that's great. Sorry, I can go on and on about ecofeminism, but we should move on to the next film. Okay, so the next one we're going to be talking about is Pom Poko. So I don't know if you mentioned that you watched this one, but Pom Poko is yet another analogy highlighting how urbanization and things like, you can even argue, gentrification and overpopulation are leaving animal inhabitants clamoring habitats are constantly exploited. In the film, of course, you have these raccoons that are having to migrate from their original home in the forest. Again, the idea of eco-activism and climate change action is portrayed as these robust raccoons try to derail the plans of these real estate developers in these Tokyo suburbs. And then, yeah, you can talk a bit more about that. And again, the theme that comes with this is overpopulation and degrowth. And so
Pom Poko is one of Takahata's films, and probably one of his more light-hearted ones. So it centers, as you said, on these raccoon dogs, which are, you know, are a specific spirit that's actually quite common in Japan called tanukis. So they try to defend their homes, obviously. I think we can also see the metaphors, you know, displacing wildlife when it comes to urbanization and gentrification. You know, but, you know, the raccoon dogs or the tanuki spirits can also be local communities, sometimes that are displaced, you know, when there's rapid urbanization. It is quite a light-hearted film in that there are funny moments when they try to come into conflict with the humans or stop them. But I think there is quite a sad and poignant part of the ending in that, the raccoon dogs eventually split into three groups. Those who, are adamant at destroying the humans and become quite violent and end up killing themselves. There's another group who has given up and just decided, suicide is the way for them. And the last group, which, is probably the most common in these cases, is that some of the tanuki spirits, they can take on human form. They end up integrating into human society. They lose their original traditions, and we can see, one of the tanuki spirits, after he becomes a worker man in Tokyo or wherever in Japan, he is nostalgic for when he was, a raccoon spirit and when he was dancing in nature. And I think, it might be me overreading into this, that does kind of also remind me sometimes of my own research, for example, local communities or indigenous communities that, because of colonization, etc., because of gentrification, eventually they lose, their own customs, their own traditions, and the only way for them to survive is to integrate into mainstream society. And, there's something quite profoundly sad at the end of this film.
Right. No, that's totally a valid point. And of course, you also have films like, even though this wasn't the ones listed, but The Secret World of Arrietty, which again, maybe it doesn't to the same extent, but again, it does. You couldn't argue that it again looks at things like mindfulness and minimalism, and again to combat the idea of materialism and hyperconsumption, I guess, of our mainstream society. Again, all the commodification that we take for granted. But yeah, we can go on to the next one. There's the last couple ones left because I definitely want to get to all the ones that are specifically listed by the WWF. Okay, so this next one, again, this isn't one of the listed ones, but I still think it's pretty relevant when it comes to sustainable development. So so I'll just go on to it. So Castle in the Sky is personally another one of my favorites, and it depicts society's over-reliance on technology and our complete and utter fascination with inadvertently assuming that, again, technology and technological innovation will resolve the crux of the problem, even things like climate change. And again, this is causing us as human beings to rationalize overproduction, I would say, and hyperconsumption in our capitalistic and profiteering society.
Yeah.
So again, this film portrays the idea of, I would argue, post-humanism, and again, that intersection between human, non-human, and the technological worlds. And in the film, if you watched it, there's like these Laputan robot troopers, and they're basically like a primitive type of robot transformer, if I can put it that way. Again, of course, it's similar to our society becoming more, I guess, automated and bionic, but in nature. But again, I think it points to things like post-humanism. Do you want to talk a bit about that? Do you have any thoughts?
Sure. It is also one of my favorite songs, but one of my older films. I think you've definitely hit the nail on the head. The most prominent scene in Castle in the Sky, and probably the most loved, is when the two kind of child characters, they finally find this castle in the sky, which is a former technological advanced city that was completely destroyed because of human greed again. And we see the robots left by the former civilization. The robot was a symbol of destruction before, but left to its own devices, it actually became a keeper of the earth. It maintained the plant species and the wildlife on this desolate city. And we see this very famous scene where this giant robot holds out a tiny flower for the two kind of child protagonists. And I think that's one of the key points that Miyazaki makes. A lot of the articles you see online, people will say that Miyazaki is opposed to technology, especially, with the rise of AI right now. So if you look at the documentaries of his life, he is not opposed to technology. He thinks technology isn't the real evil. It's human greed and overconsumption. That is the real evil here. And I think he depicts it quite well. He doesn't depict the robot as essentially bad. The robot can be a killer machine when used by evil people, but the robot can also be a gardener and protect wildlife when left to its own devices.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Again, it's a matter of perspective, and I think people maybe don't realize that. That's great. No, it's definitely good to hear your perspective, even though it doesn't have to do with environmentalism exactly per se. It's still, I think, just as relevant, because I think we're relying too much on technological innovation to resolve things like global warming due to climate change. So that's great. Okay, and last but certainly not least, we have Ponyo. So just to give a bit of background about this film, so the protagonist Ponyo basically has a desire to become a human, and it's again motivated by her love for the natural world and innate desire to protect it. I would argue the underlying lesson is that there's this almost utter necessity for humanity to live in harmony, again, with the environment. And it touches on, again, this idea of deep versus shallow ecology in terms of conservation efforts and pollution, especially illustrating this almost ethic of care. And again, addresses a delicate divide, as we have been mentioned before earlier in this episode, between the natural preservation and also against human progress. So do you want to talk more about the theme of deep ecology in this film? Does that really speak to you?
Yeah. So Ponyo is probably, one of the films more targeted at a younger audience. Miyazaki has said so. It's more like Totoro. But I think there is a theme of deep ecology in here, especially in Ponyo's, what we depict, we see as her birth mother. Her birth mother is essentially the sea or nature or whatever you want to call it. She's depicted as this, massive feminine figure who encompasses everyone, where she does appear throughout the end. And, who gives Ponyo the choice of becoming human or not? And I think this idea of deep ecology versus probably, slightly shallow is also kind of shown in Ponyo's birth father. So we see that Ponyo's birth father isn't a spirit or whatever, a fish, whatever. He was a human that chose to be, in the sea. And when Ponyo first, expresses her life of becoming a human, he shows strong distaste and then tries to stop her. Because his idea is like, why would you want to become a human, when you're part of nature? And I think, I relate to her father in a way, because sometimes I have a distaste for humanity and some of humanity. I think his father's approach is sometimes what I would call more shallow in environmental sciences. His father's approach is he had a distaste for humanity himself, so he escaped from humanity, some way or other, to become a part of nature. Once he has escaped from these group of people he doesn't like, he's staying there and he's not coming back to humanity. But I think that way, again, it's kind of a us versus them kind of idea. If we want to change or, make everyone care about environmental biodiversity conservation, we want to try to go the other way, whereas Ponyo has a curiosity for humanity. Ponyo wants to become human and see the human things. And perhaps when she becomes human in this film, she will form a bridge between humanity and nature, like Nausicaa did. And we can definitely see this deep ecology when it comes to Ponyo's mother, who is, very all-encompassing and a very feminine figure in the end of the film.
Hey, good point. Yeah, no, it's definitely, that's definitely a valid point. And we've gone to all the films, like the environmentalism one, so thank you for that. It was interesting to get your perspective on all that. So now we're just going to make a transition away from that and just kind of go more into talking about Studio Ghibli, but that was super helpful, and I know some viewers, I was going to be like, I'll add a spoiler because I totally didn't realize that some of them may have not seen all the films, but yeah, thank you for giving your perspective on each one. Now I'm just going to move into a handful of more questions, and this is again focused more again on animation and environmental itself. Why do you find that audiences and followers choose Studio Ghibli as some of their beloved all-time favorite films? What makes their medium and approach in which they convey their message inherently unique?
The main thing is probably, I think, Miyazaki is really someone, and Takahata, they don't preach at you. I don't think anyone has changed their behaviors or their opinions because I told you so. he doesn't come from, I think the issue with, including myself, in environmental sciences, is we think our value systems are superior, are better than people who are different than us. Miyazaki tends to show people and leave the audiences, you decide, you think about this conflict. I'm not going to resolve it for you. What do you think? And how will you deal with this question? And I think not preaching at the audience is something quite important, and probably we should all learn in environmental sciences.
Okay, great. And how does Studio Ghibli, again, allow us to understand our global ecosystems, including biomes, how they interact? How does it make us understand them better? And the second part of the question, how does the powerful narrative of storytelling allow us to understand systems change in regards to these ecosystems?
Okay, so I think, again, that's quite a good question. So I think Studio Ghibli, in particular Miyazaki, creates quite fantastical worlds, or, fantastical ecosystems that are not real. They are imaginary. But many of them are based, one, on realistic issues in our world, or they're based on realistic organisms. So we do see these parallels. I mean, strangely, when I was watching Nausicaa during the pandemic, we were all wearing face masks and fit were they in this post-apocalyptic world. And I think that helps us to really kind of understand, because there are kind of parallels in these fantastical ecosystems to our own worlds. They kind of mirror the issues that we currently have in our own worlds. And the way I think it helps us to understand kind of these systems is the fact that, humans are at the center of these systems. And I think generally, as a society, as individuals, we tend to understand nature or our place in nature better when we see humans being a part of it and not being separate from it. And including these kamis or these spirits, which is a Japanese concept and an East Asian concept, they form the bridge between humans and nature. They're somewhere in between because they are spirits, they're embodiments. They kind of cross the lines. So we've got humans, then kami, then got nature. But these three things are all intertwined rather than separate.
Okay, great. And how can the artistic medium of animation unlock and expose concepts such as environmental conservation and biodiversity preservation in a way that deeply resonates with audiences? So again, how can digital animation, and this is your area of expertise, how can it allow us to reimagine and revolutionize our approach to these environmental challenges that we see in the world today?
I think animation can't solve all the issue, and I have to be honest with that one, but I think it can inspire people. So despite Miyazaki's personal pessimism at times, like humanity, you'll see that most of his films, even if they're quite violent and bloody, like Princess Mononoke, there is a seed of hope at the end. For example, in Nausicaa, at the end, you see like a tiny leaf pop up in this post-apocalyptic world. In Princess Mononoke, after the forest spirit is devastated and everything dies, you see a tiny forest spirit pop up again. So I think it's these seeds of hope that we still do have optimism at the end. I think that are really important to inspire positive change. And, when people see kind of inspirational films that are not, trying to preach at them to do certain things, I think they will look into their own personal lives and be inspired to, do some personal change in their own lives.
Okay, great. And just last couple questions and to wrap up. So what is the social and environmental impact of Studio Ghibli on younger generations, upcoming youth who maybe have just recently discovered these influential films on Netflix? Like how can not only these films, but digital animation in general help those, especially like you mentioned, being a woman of color, and I don't know if a BIPOC is a thing in the UK, but again, to help those who are underrepresented, overlooked, and maybe marginalized in society.
So I think this is an interesting thing that I have noted. Perhaps I will do some research into this. As you may know, Totoro and Spirited Away has been adapted into stage plays. Totoro by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and they have both been playing in the West End, in theatres in the UK. I have attended both plays. They were all sellouts. They were all massively successful. But what I realised very interesting in the Totoro was there are a lot of people of color who are massive fans, which is not surprising given, they are Japanese animation studios, but also a lot of queer people. So I'm a queer person myself, and I have thought for a long time on why most of the queer people that I know around me really identify with Studio Ghibli's film. And I think it's important that one, it's something that's not slightly Eurocentric, less mainstream here, but also they just really love the feminism aspects of Miyazaki's films. So this is like a Easter egg extra information. Although due to the times, his own times and Japan's country and culture, Miyazaki has never, openly depicted any queer characters in his films. You could argue there is a lot of queerness in his films. So, for example, if you look at a documentary, Miyazaki actually specifically sought out a very famous Japanese drag queen to actually voice Moro, who is the wolf spirit, who is the mother of San in Princess Mononoke. And he has expressed why he specifically sought out such a person, because he thought she was the best person to voice his character. There are other, I think, things in kind of Miyazaki that just appeals to people who are marginalized as a whole.
Okay, yeah, no, that's actually very profound that you said, like, really, it's not just for BIPOC, but again, to LGBTQ community, it's very much very inclusive across the divide. And I had a few more questions, but I know I gotta go, so I'll just ask my last question here.
Sure.
So, to wrap up our interview, so what is the future vision of your own research direction, especially when it comes to environmentalism, biodiversity, and digital animation, now that you had mentioned you'd recently changed directions? So do you have any personal thoughts on the future, especially of this medium of animation, to convey the message of climate change action?
Yeah, so my research, which I am starting soon on a project, I've changed directions on trying to create environmental themed games. So games that are based on ecological social science data that are actually, scientifically sound underneath, but also are fun and engaging to play. And, hopefully in the future, when we have enough money, maybe making a video game that's, that looks or resembles a Studio Ghibli film. Miyazaki himself actually did try to sign a contract, I think, with Nintendo. He wanted to make a video game from the perspective of insects. But obviously, being a very slow worker and, him having a ton of things to do, that never materialized. So, hopefully in the future, that'll be something I can work on and inspire future generations.
Hey, great. Yeah, no, I think like the gamification aspect is really cool, but even seeing like a live action film, if that ever becomes a reality of any Studio Ghibli film, like Princess Mononoke, would be really cool, I think. I would want to see the real life version of it now, that we all know the anime version, of course, but yeah, there's a lot of potential for it. And sorry, I know that was the last of my questions, but do you have any final thoughts or something that you want to share? Maybe I missed something?
Do I have any final thoughts? I think probably important to add is obviously everyone is talking about AI right now. I think in the famous words of Studio Ghibli itself, I think when we talk about AI, we really have to think about ethics, morality, what are our personal values. I think in this really divided world right now that, human progress cannot really happen if it's not based on, decency, morality, if it's not based on compassion and kindness. There is no point in technological advances because personally I think without it being based on ethics and morality, it will probably lead to our destruction in the future.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a very profound note to end on, and so thank you so much. I learned so much from you, like, it's amazing, like, yeah, I learned so much from, like, I never really thought about these films in that way, and yeah, it's been very insightful just talking to you today, and yeah, it's been really good. I mean, you're like a spokesperson for Studio Ghibli.
So this is probably why I still become, I'd say that why I'm still a university lecturer, because, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's nice to talk to people who really care about these things and find it interesting.
Thanks so much for tuning in to yet another eye-opening episode of Sustainable You. Again, this is an extraordinary and engaging info series whose purpose is to make sustainable development and sustainability accessible to the average person in their quest to quench their knowledge on environmentalism. Be sure to leave your feedback by liking this week's released edition and by subscribing to this podcast. Again, any love from our followers is much appreciated. Signing off until next time.